Raji, we can't hear you if you're starting.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on co-evolution of horticultural breeding and product value chains, a product cycle perspective. It's a pleasure to have you join us from around the world. My name is Raj Lakshmi Nirmal, and I'm the Program Manager of the Rethinking Markets Initiative. I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the initiative and IFPRI. And before we move on, a few housekeeping remarks to note. First, the session will be recorded, and the recording will be available on KISM, our knowledge portal, within the next 2 weeks. If you have a question, please post that question in the chat box, and we'll take that up for discussion. And before the end of the webinar today, there will be a poll that will pop up on your window. Please take a few minutes to give us your feedback. And yes, if there are some technical difficulties that you encounter, please reach out to ifpri-kism@cgiar.org. Yes, and now moving on to the agenda. After setting up the context by the moderator, we will have 25 minutes of presentation from the speaker, and that will be followed by 15 minutes time to the discussant to make his remarks. And then we'll have a Q&A round for 15 minutes. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Rob Voss. Rob is the Director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit at IFPRI, and he is also the lead of the Rethinking Markets Initiative. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, Raji. Welcome everybody to this seminar organized through the Knowledge Platform for Inclusive and Sustainable Food Markets and Value Chains, KISM, which is part of CGIAR's research initiative on rethinking food markets. Please visit www.kismfoodmarkets.org to access this platform and to become a member of its community of practice. Today's seminar is part of a series of presentations by Professor Tom Reardon, providing insights into the dynamics of rapidly changing and transitioning food markets to identify hurdles to be addressed to take food systems on pathways towards greater efficiency, sustainability, and inclusiveness. Today's talk is entitled Co-Evolution of Horticulture Breeding and Product Value Chains, a Product Cycle Perspective. As we wrote in the introduction to this seminar, imagine all the steps involved in getting fruits and vegetables from the farm to your plate, figuring out how to breed better ones, creating those seeds, multiplying them, getting them to wholesalers and stores, and finally to millions of people around the world. This whole process is like the invisible building blocks that keep our food system healthy and growing. Tom Reardon's talk will focus on how changes in horticulture breeding has co-evolved with the expansion and changing operations of horticulture value chains. Transformative changes have taken place around the world in recent decades following a typical product cycle process. So this seminar, we want to explore the practical implications of these changes along horticulture value chains, but it may be more broadly applicable, and what it implies for policies and future development of horticulture in low and middle-income countries, as well as in high-income countries. Our main speaker, Tom Reardon, hardly needs any further introduction, but for all completeness, he's a university distinguished professor at the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources of Michigan State University, and he's also a non-resident senior research fellow at IFPRI, and a key collaborator with the Rethinking Food Markets initiatives. Tom will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by comments from Professor Carl Prey, who is also a distinguished professor of agriculture, food, and resource economics, but at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences at Rutgers University. So what a luxury having two distinguished professors addressing you this morning, or this afternoon, wherever you are. Before I give the floor to Tom, let me remind all of you, as Raji indicated, to submit your questions and comments in the chat box as the seminar proceeds, and we will take those on board in the Q&A part of the seminar, which will start right after Professor Prey's remarks. Without further ado, Tom, you have the floor.
I'm now sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, and let's say the view, I have to flip the view. As usual. I only do this 1,000 times a year. Can you see it okay now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about coevolution of transforming product and breeding value chains. And I'll use a product cycle perspective. And we'll illustrate with examples from horticulture, more specifically here on fruit. And I'll focus on US and New Zealand examples, but with implications for low and middle income countries, LMICs. I think that many of these economic processes are shared across regions and across countries within regions. And often you'll see something happening in richer countries or developed countries, and then you'll see the same process occur in middle income countries and eventually low income countries. So I think that these processes are shared across the planet, and I'll use an illustration from examples that have already been quite developed. The idea of the talk is that there's been a coevolution of two sets of value chains in a context of product cycle phases. In low and middle income countries and high income countries, horticulture value chains grow and co-evolve. And by horticulture value chains, I'll think of two today. One are product value chains, whose upstream includes farmers, grower, packers, etc., shippers. And midstream and downstream includes distributors such as wholesalers and resellers. And that's co-evolving with breeding value chains that you can think of as also having three stages. One is the upstream, which is composed of universities or basic research, such as in genetic selection. And secondly, the midstream with applied breeding entities, both public and private, such as Fall Creek Nursery, that I'll mention today, the largest global blueberry nursery, and seed retailers then downstream. And I'll illustrate this discussion of the coevolution of these two value chains with US and New Zealand examples, but note the relevance to LMICs and therefore to the Rethinking Markets program. You can think of the transformation of product value chains along what has been called a product cycle. And there's a traditional idea of a product cycle from Adam Smith and others that you have a product is born and then it matures and grows and then it matures. And with that, the profit rate first rises and then declines. We've adapted this idea to think of how products start and the market grows and matures. And then to survive, there's often another wave of innovation where the product is differentiated. So you can think of it as going from, let's say, a local niche product. And in this talk, I'll talk about apples and blueberries, but you can think of many of them going from a local niche product of blueberries that started in the northern US, and then a spread of that product from the niche to the broad bulk market, which you can call commoditization. And then the product is then differentiated for further diffusion. You can think of it, the example of the kiwi fruit, starting as a mountain fruit in China and then spreading through New Zealand around the world as a commodity of green kiwi, and then have a whole wave of differentiation into golden kiwi and other kinds of kiwi. So this is an example from the kiwi fruit. With this product cycle, you often see a parallel spatial diffusion of the products from each stage. And I'll give you an example of blueberries in the US. Blueberry started as a traditional niche product in northern US, and then was commoditized to various states over the past century, approximately, going first to the south and then to the west, et cetera. And then at a certain point, the original varieties of blueberries and the ones that have been adapted for commoditization to various states to be agronomically desirable in the different states were then differentiated not so much by agronomic traits, but by organoleptic traits or taste traits, size traits, shelf life traits to be differentiated blueberry varieties. So that's been the story over, let's say, 100 years of blueberry product cycle evolution as an example of what happened everywhere with blueberries. And also you can see that there was a parallel spatial diffusion over different states along with the variety change. And then these differentiated varieties that were generated in the US, and I know other countries have generated differentiated varieties of blueberries, but I'm using the US example just for the short talk. These differentiated varieties have then in the past 10, 20 years spread internationally and to really start as a niche phases in product cycles in other countries. And you can think of change agents that have done this. For example, Fall Creek Nursery based in Oregon with global operations bred a number of differentiated varieties of blueberries and then either grew them or sent them to Latin American countries, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, to France, to South Africa, to China, and to South Korea. So not just selling, they didn't sell the product as marketing of blueberries as a final product, but rather marketing of these varieties and often growing them in situ in these countries. So with this product cycle evolution, there's been a coevolution of the breeding value chains. And I think this is a key point for the Rethinking Markets program, that the coevolution or symbiosis between the knowledge or innovation value chains and value chains that provide inputs co-evolving with product value chains is a source of tremendous dynamism and transformation of these industries, both in the US and in around the world. So the breeding value chains of blueberries and apples, I'll give examples, have co-evolved with product value chains, innovating and supplying the product value chain with the varieties or traits necessary for the different stages of the product value chain evolution. And usually the movement in terms of the breeding value chain has been from a public sector dominated breeding value chain, such as in the US, mainly by the universities, moving the product from being, let's say, a niche in one particular zone or region to a broad-based commodity available to other states. And this public sector breeding has been focused on agronomic traits and application to various farm settings in various zones. So an example is US northern blueberries that were adapted and introduced to hotter southern states. Then you have a shift, a second step from public breeders to a combination of public and private sector breeders, especially private sector breeders, where when you're moving from a commodity product to a differentiated product varieties. And this will be driven by demand from retailers along with consumers, and a demand from grower and packers that are trying to market the product and expand the production base of it. And as these product and breeding value chains co-evolve, they transform in terms of technology and industrial organization. So the main thing is from niche to commodity to differentiated product, expanding from local to international, and with the breeding co-evolving, expanding along with it from public to private. And so with that general view, I'll give you an illustration of apples and blueberries from the US that I think is generally applicable to many products. And we'll illustrate this these ideas that I just mentioned of the value chain phases, et cetera, with two examples. One is a long gestation product, which is traditional from the US point of view, which is the apple, even though it comes from Kyrgyzstan, we read from Michael Pollan, and short gestation, non-traditional products, with an example of blueberry. In the paper that we are doing will eventually include strawberries, and these have global applications. We examine how the product value chain evolved, how the breeding value chain evolved, and how actors in the two value chains made value chain design decisions to implement product and breeding innovation. And we focus on a case of the triangle of fruit growers, distributors such as wholesalers and retailers, and public and private breeders. So let's look at the product value chain evolution of these fruits. Basically, these fruits started and shifted from short supply chains, let's say farmers right around a city, and also for home consumption, to long supply chains, which all of horticulture is doing throughout low and middle income countries, as well as has happened in the developed countries. And moving from fragmented or small farm production to more concentrated farming and distribution, with a rise in the US, for example, of large grower packers and supermarkets dealing in these fruits. And moved, of course, from backyard to commercial farming and from seasonal to pan-seasonal production, with retail competition and consumer demand pushing for deseasonalization of these fruits. And also from limited offer in long supply chains or supermarkets, especially with apples, let's say 50 years ago in the US, to a diversified offer where you have the rise of blueberries and other products as part of a diversification attempt by retailers to drive the market forward. And the product cycle of these products has gone from niche local varieties to commodity varieties to differentiated products. And we'll illustrate, as I said, with these two products. And the conduct of the value chain, of the product value chain, has gone from unbranded product to branded commodities to branded proprietarial varieties with intellectual property rights, for example, in apples and blueberries. And this has become a key element of competition in these sectors and drivers of the differentiation of products and technology change. The fruit breeding for these products has been in sync with the product value chain evaluation. Breeding value chains in, let's say, 50 years ago for these products was only public sector in the niche to commodity and early to late commodity stages, as I mentioned a moment ago. Government involvement in breeding apples and blueberries was to adapt a niche product from an original state to new states and territories and countries, to make it adapted according to agronomic conditions, especially that made the products accessible to farmers, and also for the taste specifications of local consumers, although the agronomic driver was the more important one. An example in the paper is Washington State University breeding and doing extension for apples. Another example is Southern states universities and extension services adapting blueberries from northern places like Michigan, and then adapting them to southern, more hot production conditions. And in this stage, government usually makes freely available the new varieties or does long licenses of the products. So it's easy for them to diffuse in those areas. And the government involvement has been most intensive in the long gestation fruit that represents a risk for producers, and take some long cycle to change the variety. And apples is a good example in the U.S. where public investment was needed for the wait time to change from variety to variety. Then you have the second stage, as I mentioned earlier, of the breeding value chains transitioning to product differentiation. And in some cases, you still have government breeding with university research doing this differentiation of fruit varieties. And this is something you see in low and middle income countries, government involved in this kind of direct breeding, for example, in Nigeria, which is another case for tomato varieties. And this is the acts of the government doing product differentiation in order to compete in already commoditized markets. So this is an example from Washington State University, breeding differentiated apples in order to try to grow the share of Washington apples in the world market. And probably more important is the rise of private breeding. Private sector breeding has occurred with several paths. One is the privatization of public breeding, for example, ENZA in New Zealand. And there's also been a very rapid rise of private firms, for example, Fall Creek Nursery in Oregon that I mentioned earlier, which is a global leader in blueberry variety differentiation. And this rise of private sector breeding has been fastest in non-traditional and short gestation fruit like blueberries, where the private payoff is high. And I could extend the talk if I had more time, where there's also, for example, East-West Seeds that breeds in short gestation vegetables. So this is a common theme of the entry of these breeders into the short gestation products. And there's been a differentiation of these products linked with the private breeders and the public breeders, linked with supermarkets that are sending signals to the breeders of what kind of varieties they want, let's say bigger fruit or organic fruit or whatever kind of fruit desired by the consumers. And of course, again, there's a parallel with vegetables, with differentiation of vegetable taste traits as well as agronomic traits, for example, by East-West Seeds. And then a third stage, which is more recent and is extremely intense. I have speakers that come to my classes and talk about a variety war, where proprietary varieties are being developed by these private breeders and public breeders in order to fight it out in the product differentiation, both at a national level and a global level. And this is occurring in blueberries as well as apples. Along with these proprietarial changes and branding changes, there's been a rapid technology change with breeding technologies. And the breeding technology has often been generated by basic science from universities. Although and then there's breeding adaptation by private companies, sometimes with contracts with universities or from universities. At the same time that you've had this structural change and technology change, you've also had industrial organization change among retailers, growers, packers, and breeders. You've seen the rise of short-term contracts among triangles of retailers, grower packers, and breeders so that they can coordinate. An example, you've also seen, besides the rise of these triangular relationships, you've seen vertical integration by product companies, for example, Driscoll's, the biggest strawberry producer in the world, into breeding. Okay, so Driscoll's has its own breeding unit, and Turner Growers, acquiring a public breeding institution in New Zealand, allowed apple growers then to have their own breeding unit. Okay, so there's been vertical integration, there's been short-term contracts, and also beside those, you've seen the formation of collective arrangements where grower packers, fruit companies, for example, have entered into consortia with breeders. okay? And they formed what you could call variety clubs. And this has been done in war with, or in competition with, the vertical integration of some of the larger fruit companies. And an example is where Fall Creek Nursery, as a breeder anchor, has worked with a group of grower packers, and there's been a mutual selection by the nursery and the grower packers so that there's breeding quality as well as outgrowing capacity and consistency to lower risk on both sides. So it's essentially alliances have arisen of breeders and sets of farm groups or grower packers in order to generate their own product differentiation capacity and counter these other actions. At the same time, there's been an emerging globalization and industrial reorganization of these value chains. So if we look at the current context in the US, it's very fascinating because with the very rapid rise of Peru in the production of blueberries and the extension of this seasonal coverage of blueberry production in Peru, there's been a collapse of what's called the seasonal window. In other words, the US used to think that during certain months of the year, it's only US production that's viable and there's no competing South American production. But with an extension of the seasons in Latin America, with the differentiation over countries and new production techniques and with irrigation and with new varieties, there's blueberries available all year from Peru. This is very recent. 1 or 2 years ago, this started, so that the U.S. farms have no seasonal window where they're the only game in town. And so now there's a lot of competition. And with that extreme competition, the differentiation of products has heated up and sped up, okay, with the rapid rise of what they call the war of varieties. And in order to grab weapons to fight this war of varieties, you had these kinds of changes in the industrial organization, like the vertical integration of grower packer like Driscoll's into breeding, or the joining of variety clubs, as I mentioned a minute ago. And then you also have globalization driven by this competition, where you have breeding and product value chain firms essentially scanning other countries to extend their product that they've developed as a commodity in one country into other countries that have favorable growing conditions and favorable consumption conditions. This idea is, you could say, comes from Raymond Vernon's idea in his product cycle articles about scanning firms like Nestle that looks around the world to see where various processed products can be implanted and grown and produced. The same thing goes for these fruit product firms and these fruit breeding firms, where they're scanning, looking around, using precision marketing essentially to determine what other countries are available to take the differentiated product from, let's say, the US, and then introduce it into another country through farming or through a marketing arrangement or licensing arrangement. And sometimes, for example, some of the fascinating ways that these companies are extending these products are actually owning the plant, but having it grown by a foreign producer. This is happening, for example, in North Africa now, with some US producers that have new farms, have outgrower farms in North Africa, but in fact own the actual plants, the actual blueberry plants in this case, that are grown on the farm. So that can be extended through this sort of direct implantation, or setting up marketing organizations or farming organizations and spreading it to areas where it's favorable for these differentiated products. So you have a very fascinating example, again, of Fall Creek Nursery that I mentioned before, where it's internationalizing its breeding value chain. by either buying up nurseries in other areas or setting up greenfield investments of nurseries in other areas, and then doing foreign direct investment in a number of countries. I mentioned them in Latin America and Asia, in Europe and in Africa, and also doing international licensing of proprietary varieties. And this internationalization of product value chains has also driven some of this extension of these differentiated varieties into other countries. The grower packers themselves, for example, have internationalized by sourcing new varieties across regions so that they had a continuous supply, let's say a pan-seasonal supply under contract to supermarket chains. An example are large blueberry companies in the US that have operations in Europe and especially in Latin America, where they're able to have all year these proprietary varieties produced at scale in order to supply them to supermarkets in the US, in Europe, and also in Latin America. And they've also undertaken risk management practices in the new sourcing locations. I mentioned this a moment ago, where they actually own the blueberry plants that are grown in the foreign outgrower locations. This is similar to the Tyson model in the US, where they own the chicks grown by the chicken farmers. So in conclusion, and I don't know about how much time I have, but we can discuss this more in detail. But I think these ideas and these examples are very applicable to low and middle income countries in various ways. One is that in LMICs, as well as in developed countries, this dynamic transformation is propelled by an economic event, the product and breeding value chain coevolution. And this is occurring both in developed countries and, as I say, emerging and happening quickly in a number of low and middle income countries. And one of the ways that this coevolution occurs and this diffusion of this transformation occurs is simply through the spread from developed countries to LMICs, as I mentioned a minute ago, with the operations of multinationals like Fall Creek Nursery. But also there's an internal dynamic in LMICs where, for example, in Chile, you have the same story that I told here, but happening in Chile, where there's breeding firms that are also engaged in coevolution with Chile-based product, let's say product value chain firms, such as in blueberries, and also engaged in selling these varieties or diffusing these varieties to blueberry firms around the world. So the same thing with Fall Creek Nursery is happening in various LMICs as their base. Okay, and there's also a spread from LMICs to other LMICs, for example, with China breeding. This is the same case with Chile, where China's doing its breeding and also then extending these varieties to other places. So there's a diffusion in various directions. You could say north-south and south-south, and all of it is that diffusion plus the competition in the product market are serving to rapidly dynamize and accelerate this coevolution of product value chains and breeding value chains that I think should be a central topic to think about in Rethinking Markets program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. This is a really fascinating story. I recall when I was a small schoolboy that in my home country, the Netherlands, I could only get blueberries by going to the woods and get some wild berries and get them when it was harvest time, and then but you couldn't get them or hardly get them in the supermarkets or in the open markets. And nowadays you can also get them there year round, and they all have the same packaging as in the US, so it's become a truly internationalized industry, I would say, where before it was, I was just talking a few decades ago, it was basically a very short supply chain, even in several high-income countries. So it's a very fascinating story. So let's move now quickly to Professor Carl Prey, who is also a bit of an accomplished in this project on analyzing these value chains. And let me give Carl the floor straight away for your comments. Over to you, Carl.
See, I need to somebody have replaced the current screen share, it says. I have a couple of slides that I want to take a look at.
Okay, am I still sharing?
I don't know. Oh no, here we go.
Yeah,
You see the beautiful red?
beautiful.
Okay, yeah, here's my chance to plug Rutgers and our beautiful red color, but I'm going to move along quickly. I mean, this is I noticed that I seem to be criticizing my own work in the sense that Tom's put me down as an author of his, not someone that's been involved in his PowerPoint, possibly to make me think again about how critical I want to be. I put together a couple of slides, and then I will try to I will include some other stuff that came up as I go along, and somebody should warn me, after 9 minutes or 8 minutes or something, that my time's about up. So anyway, the reason that I'm involved in this project a little bit is because I like this addition of the power chain. The product cycle as a component of the evolution of demand for new innovation, and in this case, in horticulture, but it could be moved to a lot of other kinds of agricultural research, as Tom sort of implied in throwing off the chicks from Tyson's, et cetera. But the thing that struck me in other examples that I came up with when I was thinking about this again is in terms of the evolution of the horticulture innovation, as crops move from niches to commodities in the U.S. and then commodities internationally, and then onto a differentiated product, and built into what Tom's been talking about is sort of an internal dynamic that's very interesting. I thought of the table grape growers in California, and in the early stages of trying to de-seasonalize table grapes, they were very involved in trying to help the farmers in Chile from to produce table grapes with the idea that having grapes year-round in the supermarkets would also increase the demand for their grapes in their season. And I suspect, this was a story that's an old story in some sense, but I suspect right now, as Tom said with the blueberries, they've created their own competition and perhaps are regretting it. But I think this would be a nice thing to go back and take a look at, just because of we have a little more time, and we can see whether this process ended up like the blueberry process that Tom is talking about right now. And also it also points to the ideas of this industrial organization shift from public to private research, because and we see it in blueberries in New Jersey. We were doing a lot of research in New Jersey. Well, we grow a substantial amount of blueberries on the health impacts of cranberries and the health impacts of blueberries and things like that. That for urinary issues and things like that. It's been a bunch of research that has shifted out the demand curve for blueberries and cranberries. But of course, we're not doing it much anymore because we're not growing that much blueberries and cranberries. So, so shifting out the demand curve for those berries is not being, it's being captured a little bit by American farmers, sorry, by New Jersey farmers, but probably a lot more by Michigan farmers and California farmers and Peruvian farmers. Excuse me. Which means that public sector can't afford to invest in this anymore, and so it has to be the private breeders, and in this case, big private breeders that can capture international benefits from it. The other example, well, that's I already talked about this. The other thing that I wanted to include, and Tom briefly mentioned it in his throwaway on organics, but in terms of differentiated products, the new big thing is what kind of environmental impact, and consumers and supermarkets and Nestle and Syngenta all are talking about regenerative agriculture, whatever that means. But the point is that there is this demand for environmental positive environmental impacts of the agriculture, which is just another component of differentiation that Tom brought up. So that's sort of reinforcing some of the interesting impacts of this product cycle concept. On the innovation supply chain or breeding supply chain, I forget exactly what phrase Tom's used. I just want to hit on the things that I talk about regularly a lot. There are things that firms have to consider besides the market on what kind of innovations they can make profitably. And whether these innovations are plant breeding innovations or whether they're mechanical innovations or whatever. The thing that I pestered Tom about earlier, and it's I mean a few days ago, was Tom says that these variety producing these new varieties of apples takes a lot longer than blueberries. I'd just like a little confirmation on that. I presume that it's true, but does it take 5 more years or 2 more years? I see all these short apple trees that are coming along, and I wonder about whether it really is that much longer to do apples than blueberries. But I think the idea of adding strawberries is a good one to make a very dramatic contrast between how long it takes to produce new varieties. And then the other point is that, and this is outside the scope of this particular talk, is that there may be other cheaper innovations that improve the quality or the traits of the final product, like mechanization or improved crop management that can reduce cost and improve the quality of these products also. So that's just really an extension for the paper, perhaps, and not just focusing on breeding. The second point, of course, is this other one that Tom mentioned in terms of the availability of new research tools, genomics, CRISPR, et cetera, that is reducing the cost of research and making it potentially more profitable for the private sector also, because they can do things a lot faster than they could do it in the past, and it's less expensive. I'm not saying a lot less. Then there's cost of inputs and marketing of these products that has to be considered, and this is one thing that the private sector is going to look at. And then there's the appropriability issue, the plant patents, the utility patents that can give you some protection, but really, as Tom mentioned, it's the structure of these companies that enables them to capture some of the benefits from R&D. And again, it's going to have to be big firms if you're talking about capturing benefits that go globally in places where patents aren't really enforced, and Of course, this idea of owning the varieties, Tom, we have to talk about this a little more so I can understand how Driscoll or whoever it is can own the blueberry plants and make that work in North Africa. I imagine it's because because of the market structure and your ability to control where you the flow of the sales of the blueberries through their network, which allows them to capture benefits. Okay, a few other ideas for future research. There's these other horticulture products. We talked about strawberries. Tomatoes, of course, are another one. And in this case, you have to, with the tomatoes, of course, you have the commodity tomatoes, which are for, tomato paste and all that kind of stuff, which are a very different crop than the eating tomatoes. But many tomatoes are hybrids, so that makes appropriability easier also. And then looking further, I guess this is really something maybe for IFPRI, at the impacts on farmers and agribusiness in the global south, in Peru, blueberries or wherever, and then the impact on farmers, consumers, and agribusiness in the north also, which is going to, those factors are going to drive the changes that take place in the future. I was trying to think of some places. I mean, one of the things that intrigues me is where in the supply chain do innovations take place? Does research and innovation take place? The previous slide gave you an indication of what firms look at, but where are those? Who gets the patents? Who makes the R&D and stuff like that? And so I was thinking of ways to do that in the U.S. And many other places, is to look and see who has like the plant patents. And of course, this is one thing that's different from seeds and all these other things with plants that are propagated through through roots and other plant parts. You have plant patents in the U.S., and I don't think we have it anyplace else, that are kind of different from utility patents or plant breeders' rights. But you can look at those things and see who, in the US, you can see who has the plant patents, who has the other kinds of IPRs along the supply chain, and therefore you see who's really doing this research. Maybe it's all being done by Driscoll's. I don't really know, but even Driscoll's, of course, is more of a it's now a breeding company, but wasn't in the past. Also, Tom, I think you could explore some of your previous work on, potato storage and innovation in India. There was that work you did on oranges in South Africa. I can't remember whether that was in response to the pandemic or what, but the power of the co-ops and the kinds of innovations that they did. The orange sellers, fighting it out with Spain for the European markets and things like that. I think there's some, going back to some of that work, you may discover some numbers that could strengthen some of your stories. So I don't know how long I've rambled on, but I guess having a slide was probably a good thing to keep me under control. So with that, I'll quit. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Carl. These are intriguing questions, and I'm quite sure Tom has long answers to provide us, but I'll try and look, Tom, we can try to be brief. And since we formally have just a few minutes left for this seminar, since we started a bit late, I suggest we take an extra 5 minutes or so. But maybe in doing so, Tom, we can also take on board some of the questions that were put in the chat box and in the Q&A box. One is related to one of Carl's last points. It's asked about the role of public sector investments in R&D and the development of the breeding, and also what that could mean for these types of value chains in that role in the low and middle income countries. So you mentioned the Washington State University role in developing it for blueberries, but how more in general is that important? And I guess related to that, what it, as Carl was asking, what does it mean also for the IPR, the intellectual property rights over the breeding quality and other differentiation of the products, and in what part of the value chain does it apply? I'll add maybe one or two more questions. We may be able to answer all of them. So one more specific question: what role does Fall Creek Farm and Nursery play in promoting sustainable and innovative agricultural practices in South Korea's blueberry industry? And that's linked to another question more generally, which was something also which Carl touched upon, is what about organic practices, and what role does it play in the marketing of the horticultural products in value chains, but maybe more specifically in the case of the blueberry or apple business. All right, let me not elaborate more on that. So a whole string of questions, Tom, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciated Carl's talk, and very glad he's a co-author. So he was he had he didn't have his claws out very much, but it was extremely useful information and ideas. And I think that the parallels of various products and how what is sort of a model of how quickly and in what ways different sorts of products with different traits, let's say their gestation period, to what degree they're processed versus eaten fresh, to what degree they're already, deseasonalized and broad versus niche, to what degree different technologies can be applied to them, breeding technologies, et cetera, and what is the market structure of the kinds of firms that dominate those products. I think all of those conditioners of these relationships between breeding and product value chain are what I retained from Carl's points. And then that also helps, though, to think about what's happening in other countries, not just, for example, in higher income countries, but, I mentioned that Chile is an example of a country that has many of these characteristics of having public sector breeding that was originally important for some products, and also in relationships with international breeding and commercialization initiatives, for example, California and Chile, and then private sector breeders that arose, either as multinationals that were involved in Chile, or Chilean firms that became multinationals and also had their own breeding operations, like hortifruit. And so I think that many of the same processes, as I mentioned, in US are occurring in low and middle income countries, or at least in middle income countries. And you also have I don't know so much the fruit situation in Nigeria, but the vegetable situation. We have a project on tomatoes in a Gates Foundation project in tomatoes in Nigeria. And, so we're looking a lot at all the aspects of that. And you certainly see the involvement, and IFPRI also works in this domain in Nigeria. You see the involvement of East West Seed. So you have a multinational vegetable company, a vegetable breeding company, Enzazaden. Also, you have these multinational breeding companies that are involved in LMICs. Okay, and you also have breeding of tomatoes, for example, by the Nigerian Horticulture Institution, the NARS, and you have also some. I think there's some might be some breeding by CGIAR in Nigeria of some of these fruits and vegetables. So the bottom line is that I don't know if the difference between Chile and Nigeria is that in Chile you already have Chilean-based multinationals and large companies that are doing breeding and in tandem with their relations with product companies, or because they're vertically integrated, versus Nigeria, where you have mainly multinationals from elsewhere that are involved in it, plus the public sector. So essentially, it could be that Nigeria looks like Chile 20 years ago. In other words, there isn't yet Nigerian multinationals that I know of that are doing the breeding, et cetera, as well as the product value chain development in the region or internationally that would figure like hortifruit in Chile. The South African case is probably more like the Chilean case, where you have homegrown major powers, but it's also the collective or the cooperative or the consortium of medium-sized and large-sized grower shippers, with the breeding programs and with internationalization, is another kind of industrial organization example of how this occurs in LMICs. And so I just a plug for the Rethinking Markets, set of papers that we're doing with Rob and others. We basically have a second paper that's in the oven that's, on developing country breeding, essentially applying this, but more to a broader set of products, with including vegetables much more, because it's also going beyond the quality focus, although you mentioned some other traits like environment and health, et cetera, but quality, health, environment, quality and health focus of this paper for one publication path and one focus of quality differentiation. And then the second paper is more on resilience, okay, and environment and linkages of that, and much more on the developing country perspective of that. But I think that this paper has its interface already. The quality differentiation occurs with income increase, so that you could say that maybe in the poorest country, this is least applicable except at the commoditization phase. And then at the middle income countries that I mentioned, Chile, et cetera, South Africa, and others, you basically have a very similar product cycle. And we can emphasize that in the paper. These webinars are useful for the papers. We can emphasize that there's a parallel thing that's happening, and we'll include cases in the paper of parallels where there's product differentiation for quality differentiation that are occurring in Chile and South Africa, et cetera, with similar kinds of processes or similar kinds of trends and structural change. So it's more an emphasis on the product type, the interface with trait types or trait sets like resilience, et cetera, versus quality differentiation that differentiate these two outputs for rethinking markets. And this webinar has been useful to me in making sure that thinking that this paper has a broad enough set of examples that it's seen as generalizable processes that are sure correlated with income to a certain degree, but also happening very broadly in many low and middle income countries, especially middle income countries. I think that was everything. I think that the question in the chat by Vanessa, I think, is basically to what degree is there public sector? And I think that the public sector commoditization phase, you could say that, for example, the Nigerian horticulture NARS is doing things to breed for climate and disease resistance of tomatoes. So that would figure more in the second paper. So public sector traditionally in the US has also mainly done that, looking at agronomic traits. But Carl points were very useful in recalling for us that even in the quality differentiation phase, there's agronomic traits and processability and mechanization and other agronomic practice complementarities that have to be thought of. That it's not just forget about agronomic diffusion, agronomic practices and agronomic adaptability and appropriateness. But when you're thinking about product differentiation for quality, no, you can think about them at the same time. But usually the public sector got most involved because it had its clientele being the state's farmers, and the NARs having the country's farmers as their main stakeholders and not so much the consumers. So they kept an eye more on agronomic applicability and differentiation, like Nigeria is doing for tomatoes, for heat resistance, for the disease resistance. And then you have, for quality differentiation, you have the role of East-West Seeds and others that are doing this kind of differentiation. Now, what is the relationship between them? Obviously, in the US, there's been a competitive relationship. Maybe there isn't yet a competitive relationship in developing countries. I don't know. And I don't know, for example, in Chile, but you tended to have, for example, Washington State trying to do differentiation of varieties, to spread its own economic, reach, for example, of the farmers in Washington. And then probably I think there's direct revenues from licensing of these varieties that they do. So you have differentiation, but then you have private breeding companies. And something that'll be introduced in the paper, but more as an agenda for research, is something that Carl mentioned at the end, which is that you also have a differentiation of technology of breeding. The traditional selective breeding that is mostly used for the for fruit and vegetable breeding, but more and more you have CRISPR and various genetic modified products and ways of accelerating breeding that are being used in, and as David Zilberman was mentioning, which is added to this paper, will be added to this paper, but as an agenda, is what is there's plenty of activity of essentially genetic firms, right, that are really CRISPR firms, for example, that then apply their CRISPR methodology, like Boston Therapeutics, that went into agricultural breeding and was purchased by Bayer. Basically, they then went into crop breeding. Okay, so it's essentially a chemical seed company that acquires a medical CRISPR company, GMO company, and then extends into cropping, crop traits. Will they behave differently? Will they shake up and change these sort of structural changes that we're talking about, compared to the Fall Creek Nursery, which doesn't use the CRISPR and is using regular selective, selection and is already product focused? Maybe one will eat the other, or one will acquire the other, or their competition will change this dynamic that we're talking about. That's a paper in itself, a third paper.
There we go. Thanks a lot, Tom. We're running well over time, but this is a really fascinating case and actually story about rapidly changing food supply chains, and often completely misunderstood. So we're happy to have you and also Carl to give us those insights, and hopefully in the paper we can elaborate a bit further, including addressing some of the additional questions that were raised in the chat. So this is a great seminar. So with that, I'm going to close the seminar, also because I have to run to the next one. But having said that, let me thank both Carl and Tom for their insights. And everybody, please look out for the paper that hopefully will come out shortly. With that, I'm going to give it back to Raji for some final housekeeping remarks. Over to you. Reggie.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Professor Tom Reardon and Carl Prey, for all the valuable insights. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us today. We have covered a lot of ground, and I hope you found the discussion as informative and as engaging as we did. And we truly appreciate you all taking the time to share your thoughts with us through the polls. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day. And we hope to see you all at our next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.